If you think a uniform makes a man a hero, you've been blinded by the same fabric that covered my scars for 40 years. I spent my life bleeding for a flag that folded itself neatly into a triangle and tucked itself away while my family rotted in the shadows of progress. It's time we stop pretending that loyalty is a two-way street and admit that sometimes the only way to get justice is to steal it back from the hands of the righteous. Colonel Silas Vance sat in his dim kitchen, the harsh glow of a single overhead bulb casting deep skeletal shadows across the map spread before him. His hands, once steady enough to calibrate a sniper scope in a gale, now trembled slightly as he traced the perimeter of the New Dawn Heritage Center. It wasn't a monument to the fallen, but a sprawling glass and steel vanity project built on the very acreage promised to his battalion's survivors, land now owned by a man who had never seen a day of dirt in his life. The thin walls of the apartment vibrated with the sound of his daughter, Elena, coughing in the next room, a dry, ragged sound that cut through Silas like shrapnel. He looked at the stack of medical bills held down by a heavy brass paperweight, a literal weight of debt that 40 years of distinguished service couldn't lift. The local hero, Marcus Thorne, was currently appearing on the evening news, smiling as he broke ground on a multi-million-dollar Veterans Plaza, while the actual veterans were being evicted from the surrounding blocks. Silas arrived at the construction site under a bruised purple sky, the cold rain slicking his gray hair against his skull as he stared at the high-tech security gates. He didn't see a community center. He saw a fortress built with stolen capital and guarded by men who wore tactical gear like a fashion statement. One of the guards, a kid barely 20 with a pristine rifle, stepped into the light and told Silas to move along before he got hurt. Silas didn't move, his eyes locked on the guard's boots that had never stepped on anything more dangerous than a polished tile floor. "You're standing on my grave, son, and you don't even have the decency to take your hat off," Silas said, his voice a low, raspy growl that made the younger man flinch. The guard laughed, a nervous, mocking sound, and told the old-timer that his time was up and the world belonged to people who actually knew how to build things. Silas felt a cold, familiar stillness settle over his heart, the same predatory calm that had kept him alive in the jungles of the 80s while his friends were being sent home in boxes. The next morning, Silas sat in Marcus Thorne's plush clinical office, the air smelling of expensive leather and forced sincerity. Thorne leaned back in his ergonomic chair, offering a condescending smile and a thank you for your service that felt like a slap across the face. Silas didn't take the offered hand, instead sliding a folder across the desk containing the original land deeds from 1954, documents Thorne had spent years and thousands of dollars in legal fees trying to bury. "Those papers are relics, Colonel. Just like your sense of entitlement to a world that moved on without you," Thorne said, his tone sharpening into a jagged edge. He explained, with the practiced patience of a predator, that the land was better used for a monument that inspired the masses rather than a housing project for, quote, broken men. Silas watched the man's pulse jumping in his neck, noting the expensive watch that cost more than Elena's entire year of health care, and realized that talking was just a delay tactic for the inevitable. Silas walked through the local VA clinic, a place of peeling paint and fluorescent lights that buzzed like dying insects, watching men younger than him stare at nothing with hollow eyes. He saw a former sergeant from his unit, a man who had lost both legs in a roadside ambush, arguing with a clerk over a denied claim for a basic wheelchair. The clinical indifference of the bureaucracy was a second war, one fought with pens and red tape, and Silas knew he couldn't win it by following the rules of the people who designed the maze. Back in his workshop, Silas began disassembling his old tactical gear, the metal clinking in the silence like a countdown clock. He wasn't planning a protest or a lawsuit. He was planning a breach, using the very skills the government had spent millions of dollars perfecting in him. He looked at a photo of his late wife, her smile a fading memory of a life before the bitterness took root, and promised her that Elena wouldn't be the next casualty of his duty. He spent the evening monitoring the New Dawn security feeds, hacking into the impenetrable system with the ease of a man who had bypassed state-level firewalls in hostile territories. The charity's digital ledger was a masterpiece of fraud, showing millions of dollars being funneled into offshore accounts under the guise of administrative costs for the veteran monument. Every line of code Silas scrolled through was another reason to burn the whole system down, another proof that the philanthropist was just a thief in a better suit. Silas met with 3 of his old squad members in a rain-slicked alleyway, the steam rising from their coffee cups like ghosts in the dark. These weren't the men they used to be. They were tired, hobbled by age and neglect, but the fire in their eyes ignited the moment Silas showed them the ledger. They didn't ask about the legality of the plan, and they didn't ask about the risk of prison. They only asked when they could start hitting back at the people who had spent decades hitting them. "We aren't soldiers anymore, Silas. We're just targets," one of them whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. Silas gripped the man's shoulder, his fingers digging into the worn fabric of a thrift store jacket, and told him that tonight they were going to be the ones pulling the trigger. The plan was a surgical strike against the New Dawn's central vault, where the charity kept its liquid assets and the hard drives that proved Thorne's corruption. The final scene of the night was Silas standing in the rain outside Elena's window, watching her sleep through the glass while her chest rose and fell in labored rhythms. He held a black tactical mask in his hand, the fabric feeling heavy with the weight of the line he was about to cross. He knew that by sunrise, he would either be a savior or the most hated man in the state. But as he turned away into the darkness, he realized he had stopped caring about his reputation the moment his country stopped caring about his life. The heist didn't begin with an explosion, but with the hauntingly familiar silence of a tactical blackout, plunging the New Dawn Heritage Center into a tomb-like darkness. Silas moved through the corridors with the muscle memory of a ghost, his silhouette cutting through the high-contrast security beams that flickered uselessly against the wall. He wasn't thinking about the law. He was thinking about the refrigerated medicine Elena needed, and the decades of silence he was finally breaking with every heavy footfall. In the security hub, the young guard Silas had confronted earlier stared at a wall of dead monitors, his hand trembling as he reached for a radio that only emitted static. Silas emerged from the shadows like a manifestation of the kid's worst fears, the barrel of his weapon cold and steady as it leveled at the center of the boy's chest. "Keep your mouth shut, and you might live to see 30, Silas whispered, his voice a gravelly reminder that mercy was a luxury he had run out of years ago. While his team bypassed the physical locks of the vault, Silas stood before the massive, gilded portrait of Marcus Thorne in the lobby, the philanthropist's painted eyes full of false empathy. With a sharp, deliberate motion, Silas drove a combat knife into the center of the canvas, dragging it down until the image of the hero was nothing but a tattered, gaping wound. It was a petty act of vandalism. But to Silas, it was the first honest thing he'd done since coming home from a war that never truly ended. The vault door groaned open, revealing stacks of cash and hard drives that hummed with the digital heartbeat of $1 million deception. His squad members, men who had been reduced to counting pennies for bread, stared at the fortune with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. "Don't just look at it," Silas barked, the command snapping them back into their roles as they began packing the, quote, donations into rugged duffel bags. As they exited through the service tunnels, the sirens began to wail in the distance, a high-pitched scream that tore through the midnight air like an accusation. One of his men panicked, dropping a bag of currency that burst open, scattering bills across the wet pavement like fallen leaves in a storm. Silas grabbed the man by his collar, forcing him to look at the approaching blue and red lights, and told him that a soldier only fears the things he hasn't planned for. They reached the safe house just as the first police perimeter was being established around the city center, the tension in the room thick enough to choke the air. Silas began distributing the funds into pre-marked envelopes, each addressed to the families of the men who had been evicted to make room for Thorne's monument. He wasn't just stealing money. He was redistributing the debt of a nation that had defaulted on its promises to the people who had paid for its freedom in blood. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon, casting long, accusatory shadows across the floor where Silas sat alone, the hard drives of evidence cooling beside him, he knew the digital trails would lead the FBI straight to Thorne's offshore accounts. But he also knew the physical trail would lead the local police straight to his own front door. He looked at the last envelope, the one meant for Elena, and felt a strange, hollow sense of peace that no metal had ever been able to provide. A knock at the door wasn't the police, but Thorne himself, flanked by 2 private security contractors who looked ready to kill for their boss's lost pride. Thorne entered the room with a sneer, looking at the grimy veteran and the stolen bags, offering a deal, return the drives, and he'd make the misunderstanding disappear. "You think I did this for a paycheck, Marcus?" Silas asked, a dry, humorless laugh echoing off the bare walls as he held a lighter over the first set of incriminating documents. As the confrontation turned violent, when one of Thorne's men lunged, Silas moved with a predatory speed that age hadn't managed to dull, pinning the younger man against the wall with a forearm to the throat. He stared directly into Thorne's eyes, showing him the raw, unfiltered rage of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose and everything to gain from a final stand. "You built a monument to our sacrifice while you were the one holding the knife," Silas spat, his voice trembling with the weight of 40 years of suppressed fury. Thorne backed away, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he realized that no amount of money could buy off the ghost he had helped create. He tried to argue that he was good for the city, that he provided jobs and hope, but Silas just tossed a handful of the stolen bills at his feet. "You provide theater," Silas countered. "I'm providing the truth, and the truth is going to cost you every single thing you think you own." As Thorne fled the safe house to call in his favors with the police chief, Silas sat back down and finished writing a letter to his daughter, his handwriting sharp and unapologetic. He explained that a man is defined by the lines he refuses to let others draw for him, and that he was finally drawing his own. The sound of tires screeching on the gravel outside signaled the arrival of the authorities, but Silas didn't reach for his gun. He reached for a glass of water and waited. The final scene of part 2 found Silas standing at the window, watching the tactical teams deploy across his lawn, their lasers dancing across his chest like fireflies. He knew the world would call him a criminal by noon, but as he looked at the envelope addressed to Alana, the one that would pay for her surgery and her future, he felt more like a soldier than he ever had in uniform. He adjusted his posture, squared his shoulders, and prepared to face the final judgment of a town that was about to wake up to a very different reality. The tactical teams breached the front door with a deafening crack, but they found no resistance, only a man sitting in a shaft of cold morning light. Silas kept his hands visible, fingers interlaced behind his head, as the red dots of a dozen rifles settled on his tattered fleece jacket. He didn't look like a high-stakes thief. He looked like a weary janitor who had finally finished cleaning a very dirty room. The lead officer, a man Silas had once coached in Little League, looked at the stacks of cash and the hard drives with a face full of conflicted misery. "You should have just called the papers, Silas. You didn't have to pull a job," the officer whispered, the handcuffs clicking into place with a finality that echoed through the empty house. Silas didn't flinch at the metal against his wrists, instead nodding toward the kitchen table where the evidence against Thorne sat ready for the world to see. "The papers would have been bought off by lunch, David," Silas replied, his voice calm and devoid of regret. "I needed to make sure the money moved faster than the lawyers could stop it." As they led him through the front yard, the neighbors had gathered behind the yellow police tape, their faces a blur of shock and whispered accusations. He saw the parents of the kids he'd taught, the shopkeepers he'd protected, all looking at him as if he were a stranger who had just burned down their church. Then he saw Elena standing on the edge of the crowd, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a fierce, sudden understanding. She didn't scream or cry. She simply pressed a hand against the glass of the police cruiser as it pulled away, a silent vow of loyalty. The trial was a media circus, with Thorne's high-priced legal team painting Silas as a disgruntled, mentally unstable veteran who had lost his grip on reality. They showed photos of the damaged portrait and the terrified young guard, trying to build a narrative of a dangerous man who had betrayed his oath. Silas sat in the dock in his dress blues, the medals on his chest, catching the harsh courtroom lights, looking less like a defendant and more like a judge, waiting for the jury to catch up. The turning point came when the defense played the audio from the hard drives, Thorne's own voice laughing about cleaning the streets of the very veterans his charity claimed to serve. The courtroom went deathly silent, the air thickening with the collective realization that the villain in the room wasn't the man in handcuffs, but the man in the front row. Silas watched Thorne's face crumble, the philanthropist suddenly looking like a cornered rat as the public gallery began to murmur with a rising tide of indignation. As the story unfolds, slowly and gently, we hear the words just as they were given to us. "I didn't steal that money. I reclaimed it on behalf of every man who was promised a future and given a monument instead," Silas stated when he finally took the stand. He spoke without emotion, detailing the exact dollar amounts Thorne had skimmed while his daughter couldn't afford her inhalers or her rent. The prosecutor tried to pivot back to the legality of the heist, but Silas simply asked the jury if the law mattered more than the lives it was supposed to protect. The verdict was a split decision that satisfied no one, guilty of grand larceny, but with a recommendation for the absolute minimum sentence due to the evidence of Thorne's systemic fraud. Silas was sentenced to 5 years, a virtual life sentence for a man of his age and health. But he didn't look defeated when the judge banged the gavel. He looked toward the back of the room, where Elena stood with a lawyer he had paid for with the very first bag of cash. Her nod confirming the surgery was scheduled. 6 months into his sentence, Silas sat in the prison yard, the gray walls and barbed wire a familiar kind of fortress that didn't bother him. He received a letter from Elena, containing a photo of her standing in front of a new, modest apartment building where the Heritage Center used to be. The scandal had forced the city to seize Thorne's assets, and the land was finally being used to house the men who had actually served. The Colonel's heist had become a local legend, a story people told when they wanted to argue about the difference between what is legal and what is right. Thorne was eventually indicted on federal charges, his empire collapsing under the weight of the digital evidence Silas had risked everything to secure. The public remained polarized, some calling Silas a vigilante who spit on the rule of law, while others wore "Vance was right" pins on their lapels. Silas didn't care about the labels. He only cared that the coughing in Alina's letters had stopped, replaced by stories of her going back to school. In the final scene, Silas is seen walking toward the prison fence during his 1 hour of recreation, staring at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. He looked at his hands, calloused, scarred, and finally clean of the burden of a false loyalty, and felt a profound sense of victory. He had spent 40 years following orders that meant nothing, and one night breaking laws that meant everything. The smile he wore as the guards called him back to his cell was the smile of a man who had finally won the only war that mattered. Was Silas a hero who did what the system wouldn't? Or a criminal who used his skills to justify a personal vendetta? If you were in his shoes, would you choose the law? Or would you choose your family?